Welcome to Penn State Dickinson Law's Profiles in Leadership series. My name is Darrell Lim. I serve as the H. Lady Montag Professor of Law and Associate Dean for Research Innovation and Innovation at the Law School. This series offers an unparalleled opportunity to glean insights from top leaders who serve in government, education, the private sector, and civil society. In each episode, we invite these leaders to reflect on their journey and share skills, core values, and qualities that make them the leaders they are today. We're very pleased to have Martin Brinkley, the William Rand Kenan Jr. Distinguished Professor and Dean at the University of North Carolina School of Law. Dean Brinkley became the 14th Dean of the law school in 2015, the first person to lead the law school directly from practice in its 175-year history. During his deanship, the school became among the top 10 public university law schools in the United States. Carolina Law recently completed a successful $78 million capital campaign. Dean Brinkley also serves as faculty director of the Institute for Innovation, a group of 3 legal clinics that provide early-stage legal counsel to new for-profit and non-profit ventures. Welcome, Dean Brinkley.
Honored to be with you. Thank you very much.
Well, let's start with your transition from practice into your deanship. One of the things that you mentioned in your address was when asked why this transition, you described the law school as the most precious institution. Take us back to the time where you were mulling this transition and tell us what prompted you to make that move.
Well, as you said, I've been dean now. I'm in my 9th year of service, and I guess a few things should be said preliminarily before I answer the question directly. I think when one looks at a statement like the first and only person to come to the law school as dean directly from practice in 175 years, it feels like and is probably intended to sound as a fairly dramatic statement. And yet I think there are aspects of it in my case that really are not so particularly dramatic. So I'll allude to those in a moment. The second point I would make is I did not seek this position. That's important, I think, to know. I was approached about the position and eventually persuaded to be part of an applicant pool in which I was certain that I wouldn't be taken seriously, and agreed to be part of that pool, not for any reason having to do with actually expecting I might become a law school dean as a result of it. So that's a second point. And then I suppose the third point would relate to the circumstances completely external to me that I think resulted in the decision going in the way that it did. So to take sort of each one of those pieces in order, I did classics as an undergraduate at Harvard. I did some graduate work in classics and had fully intended on an academic career as a classics scholar and doing Greek history basically for the rest of my life. Decided to go to law school for reasons that were unclear to me at the time, but that had something to do with combining my scholarly academic interests in the classical world, which is a world that embodies a great deal of the values that we lawyers bring to bear in our lives on a daily basis, with the needs of the world of my time. That was really my idea, at least, half-baked as it may have been. So my point here really is the idea of an academic career was not wholly new to me when I got involved in the search for the deanship here at Carolina. And I had really intended on an academic career, which means that there were some aspects of my personality that were inclined in this direction anyway. And I think that's important to know. This was not a situation of just, a full-on corporate lawyer doing nothing but deals. I was a corporate lawyer, interested only in, the latest EBITDA definition poured out of some accounting firm who suddenly becomes dean of a law school. It really wasn't like that. And the way that I practiced law was probably in some ways a little more academic than perhaps some of my colleagues in the law firm. So that's one piece. Another piece, as I said, is I did not seek the position. I had always thought I would get our three children through college and would then do some kind of public service. I never thought it would be being a law school dean. It really never occurred to me. I had taught here as an adjunct faculty member at one point, but being a law school dean simply really never occurred to me as a possibility. And I was then approached by the search committee and asked to apply, and so decided that if it would be good for the university and the law school to be able to say that a non-traditional candidate was in the mix, that I probably owed it to the institution to provide that, even though I was absolutely confident that it would just be for maybe one round of the deanship search. I guess the other point that I would make is that as the process went forward, certain things were happening external to the law school. Some were already in process, some happened while the search was underway, that had to do with the changing political dynamics of the state of North Carolina. And I don't think I'm speaking out of school in saying that at that time, I think there was thought to be a desirability on the part of the university leadership of an appointment that would reconnect with the state of North Carolina in some way. This was clearly not a time when the school was looking for a nationally renowned legal scholar, which I certainly am not. So, I am a product of those circumstances, not because of any merits of my own, but because they're the circumstances that presented themselves at the time, and I just happened to tick a couple of boxes. So that's really how the deanship came about. And I think it's fair to say that everyone, including myself, wondered how this was going to work out.
And it's always nice to have a sense of humor going into things.
Yes.
So I'm going to ask you in a moment about your first term, but as a process of that transition, how did you prepare yourself for your first day as dean?
Well, I did a few things. I think I read the Carnegie Foundation report. I had read that in the process of being in the search. Although the report was fairly old at that point, it was about 14 years old, I think. The issues were still current enough and discussed in very clear terms. I found that extremely helpful. And Judith Wegner, one of my predecessors here, had been one of the lead authors of the report. So I was familiar with it because she had shared it with me sometime previously. So I read the Carnegie report. I then wrote a memorandum to myself, which is a habit that I have, describing what I thought the challenges facing the law school were. And I just simply kept the memo. I didn't show it to anyone. I'm sure the thoughts that were in it became the subject of meetings with the provost and with outside groups, but ultimately the memo was to myself and was intended to be sort of a bit of a placeholder and a measuring stick for how I was doing. And of course, when one hasn't even been in the job, the core question is, have I identified the issues correctly? What was interesting, and I hesitate to say this because it might sound in some way self-aggrandizing, when I reread the memo at the end of my first term, and I hadn't read it more than a time or so in those 5 years, I found that it described really right down to the ground what the challenges had been. I had been going in the right direction, and I don't say that out of some sense of particular achievement on my part. I think it's just a matter of these jobs and those who hold them sort of meet each other sometimes, and you're lucky that you're in a position in which maybe you have identified you're able to identify a few correct things. Someone else in the position could probably have done exactly the same thing, but it did work out for me.
Oh, did you write another one for your second term?
Well, I would say no. It was more an extension of the things we were already doing. I think it's fair to say that as one continues being dean, at least for me, the agenda items start to grow fewer. They may be substantial. They may be more difficult to achieve. I think they probably are. But you've done a fair amount of what you essentially were hired to do, what you have identified for yourself. And now we're down to a core list of things that you're still trying to carry out. I remember that I had a conversation with a faculty member at another law school who is an alumnus of ours, who had been a law professor for 30, maybe even 40 years. And a comment he made to me early on in my tenure was that he had served under a number of deans, and that any dean who serves 5 years or fewer, whatever they do, just washes away like a sandcastle on the beach. It doesn't take root. It doesn't last. You've got to stay in place, this person told me, at least 7 years for your goals to really become sort of part of the warp and weft of the place. And obviously we've passed that point. So that was a goal, I think, often for people in these jobs. I mean, the median tenure of an American law school dean is 3 years now. So if you want to do something significant for your institution, survival needs to be a goal just by itself, simply being there, because you cannot, as dean, move the steering wheel is not entirely in your hands. You get to touch it occasionally, and when you touch it, it can be very important. But you've really got to be patient enough to let things, if it's turning an ocean liner, at some point there's enough impetus behind the ship that it will start to move in that direction. You got to wait for that.
And I want our listeners to note that you are past that important milestone of 7 years. You're now into your 8th. So congratulations. Whatever institutional reforms that you wanted to put in place, I think at least I've had a chance to take root. So I'm going to ask you for your 2 terms together and just reflect on them individually, but also, if you like, together, because it sounds like there's some continuity there. What are some of your leadership lessons and takeaways from your time as dean, 2015 to 2021 and 2021 to the present?
Leadership lessons and takeaways. I'll throw a few around, and I'll probably think of some others later. The first and maybe most important is, I think the leader must understand himself or herself. And we're all growing and changing human beings. So when I talk about understanding myself, I'm trying to understand a human being who is in the process of change. As one simple factual change, I've gone from being the father of a son who was in his first year of high school to a son who's now a professional cellist living in New York City. Same kid, but very different period of life. And so there's change. Anyone who's a parent knows that children change it very quickly. So I think that's the first thing, is knowing oneself and learning how to be gracious and provide grace to oneself as one changes. And that's very hard for lawyers. I think it's hard for lots of people who are of high achievement, but I do think it's necessary. As part of understanding myself, I would say one thing that I have gotten very comfortable with is deciding what I'm going to be bad at. I really believe that to be highly successful in the ways one really values, one almost must make a conscious decision to be not so good at some things, because these jobs are all encompassing. And if you attempt to get an A at everything, you'll wind up with a B minus at everything.
So what would some of those things be in your
The things that I've done badly? Yeah. So one definitely is sort of personal contact with faculty and staff. I don't walk around the faculty halls, sitting down in faculty offices, telling people how wonderful their latest article is. I probably should. It's not that I don't think their latest article is wonderful. It's that it's just not the best use of my time for the kind of dean that I am. There will probably be a dean, maybe my successor, who will do precisely that. But I've simply decided my time needs to be used in other ways. My predecessor, Jack Boger, wonderful person and magnificent dean here, was, I would say, much more close to individual faculty and to their activities. I take the view that being a faculty member at a fine law school like this is a great privilege, and you ought to be able to enjoy that privilege without a whole lot of attaboys or attagirls from, the dean. That's not how some faculty see it, and I'm content to receive their C's or C minuses on that front. So that's one example. Another thing that I do, and I don't know whether this is necessarily something that gets a C or not, is I'm very, very hands-off with my senior staff. I'm the opposite of a micromanager. I personally don't like dealing with details of administration. I'm not necessarily saying I'm a terrible administrator. I'm probably decent at it, but I'm very impatient with details. And I think I'm not saying anything that you couldn't interview my associate deans and they would all tell you this, and they would all know they have my permission to tell you whatever you want to ask them. I really leave them alone. We've been very fortunate to hire just an outstanding team, and any dean worth their salt is good by virtue of the associate deans in particular, who are immediately around them. My associate deans understand their areas infinitely better than I do. My job, when I hire an associate dean, I'll say this, I like to use this metaphor. I always tell them, if you come here, your job is to be General Eisenhower. I want you to cross the Channel and take Paris. When you are standing by the Eiffel Tower, call me and I will fly over and celebrate with you. My job is to be Franklin Roosevelt and get the House and the Senate to pay for the war. So if my associate deans make a decision and the decision is great, I give them all the credit in the world and claim none for myself. If a decision is made that doesn't work out, as long as it was motivated by the right intentions and we did a rigorous process and we're doing our best, I would never chastise or count that against a person for a raise or promotion or anything, because we're all going to make mistakes and it's a waste of time. So, some of my associate deans might like it if I were more available to them on a daily basis for decisions that they want to make. But that's just a cost of working with me. So I'm always confronted with the things I don't do well, and I try not to think about them in terms of some sort of blame or negativity. How are they facilitating the things that I can do reasonably well?
That is a fascinating contrast with something you shared in an earlier interview, where you shared you teach corporations, and one of the things you try to do is to take 2 or 3 students out after class and have lunch with them, which is very unusual for a law professor, let alone a dean, as busy as most deans are. And so they have, as your students, close access, you have lunch with them, but not your faculty colleagues or your direct reports. Why that contrast?
Well, I meet with faculty colleagues or direct reports at other times, and there are other venues for conversation with them. When it comes to students, we're talking about a very finite time continuum. They are here today and gone tomorrow. And it's very, very important to me that my students feel that they knew the dean or had an opportunity to know the dean. I've heard many colleagues who are now lawyers who, when they hear that I'm the dean at Chapel Hill, they will say, "Oh, I never saw the dean when I was in law school. I didn't know who the dean was, or I know who the dean was, but I didn't dare to speak to him or her." That strikes me as just as wrong as it could possibly be. This profession has to be built on civility and on relationship. And I do take 3 students out to lunch after my BA class. I should maybe say I teach a full load as a faculty member. I teach business associations in the fall, I teach property in the first year in the spring, and I teach legal history in the fall, which my faculty colleagues here think is insane. And probably wish that I would spend more time going out and raising money. But we finished a successful capital campaign, as you pointed out earlier, and teaching and being with students is frankly what keeps me in the job, because it's so immensely rewarding. And I tell my students when we go to lunch that they are free to ask me anything, that as far as I'm concerned, while they're students now, they essentially have already graduated from the school. They're going to be alumni very soon, and they deserve to know how the school works.
Well, what's the most interesting question they've asked you?
Lots of really great questions about external relationships, political pressures, those sorts of things. They will sometimes ask about admissions. They're interested in the finances to some extent, all the right questions, the questions alumni want to know about. And I delight in sharing very candidly with them anything that they want to hear. My hope is that, of course, I tell them that they may think that it's some big deal to have lunch with the dean. Really, the honor is all mine because I get to spend this time with them, learn about their backgrounds, what jobs have they already obtained or thinking about obtaining, how do they feel about the school. It gives me a really grainy sense of our student body that I wouldn't have otherwise.
And do many of these relationships that you establish, taking them out for lunch as students, continue after graduation? As alumni, do they come back and say, "I'm so glad we had this relationship, and let's continue seeing what we can do together"?
Yes, I hear from them quite regularly. I do other things that are probably a bit unusual for faculty members with regard to students. For example, my students who I'm sort of notorious for devising very difficult BA exams, and it's a little famous around the school, and as sort of a dreaded drafter of particularly multiple choice questions. I do essays too, but I do some multiple choice. And when I've graded all of the exams, the students who do well get a call from me praising them. And the students who have gotten the lowest grades in the class get a call from my secretary who asks them to come in for a meeting with me. And of course, the students are petrified and think that I'm going to, kick them out or something. And I sit them down in my office and say to them, "You're not here for the reason that you think that you're here." I practiced law for 22 years, and no one knows better than I do that academic success in law school is really not particularly probative of what kind of a lawyer you're going to be. And I've known many people who got lots of C's in law school who wind up being general counsel of the company and giving the work to the law review editors who are out in private practice somewhere. So I say to them, please don't let how you may feel about your performance on your exam get in the way of our having a friendship and a relationship going forward. And don't hesitate to call on me for a reference or for anything that I can do for you, because I have absolute confidence that you're a person of immense abilities, and this exam is really, I'm going to have forgotten how you did in 6 months. So let's focus on the big picture here.
So a couple of follow-up questions. What you said is really interesting. Well, first of all, if they are C student, what would you focus on in terms of commending them in your recommendation letter?
Well, if they asked for one, I would try to be sure that I had enough knowledge of them one-on-one to say something that was honest and what I believed in my heart about them. In other words, there might need to be a follow-up meeting from the lunch that we had while they were a BA student. But past that, I would focus on issues of personality, emotional intelligence, both of which are immensely important in dealing with clients. Lawyers who can explain the law are a dime a dozen. The law is just the table stakes, and anyone can figure out the law, given enough time and access to the right materials. Any student who comes to this law school can figure out the law. Not every student can explain the law in a simple fashion to a client, can advise the client, or build enough of a relationship with the client to be able to urge the client away from a particular course of action or towards another course of action. That takes a certain kind of emotional intelligence that some people who are academically very capable have not developed to the same degree. So I try to focus on those sorts of things, and it usually proves to be fairly prescient.
So that brings me to the second part of my question, and that is, are we as legal educators and as legal institutions rewarding really the things that don't count as much? And should we think about integrating more of these practical attributes into how we assess what makes a good student and what makes a good grade?
Yeah, it's a wonderful question. And as my previous answer probably indicated, I think the answer is yes. I think there is value in the academic parts of legal education for all 3 years. I don't think law school should be shortened. I don't think we should only have a 1L year followed by a bar exam and then in completely practically focused second and third years. I think the model that we have is fairly good. What I wish we could do is find ways to lift students up rather than depress them in the way that we evaluate their performance. I wish we could find a way to show students where they can improve academically in ways that translate directly into practice. You do need to be able to do legal analysis. I taught a makeup class this morning. As folks may have heard, we had a tragic shooting here on the UNC campus a couple of weeks ago, in which a faculty member was killed by a graduate student. And as a result of that, we had 2 days without class, and so I missed a BA class. I had a makeup class this morning with my BA students, and we spent 2/3 of the class going over a hypothetical for an exam that the students might take for me. And I described very, very clearly to them what I want to see in an exam answer and make it very clear that I'm not interested in them just dumping ink on the piece of paper. We talk about how to organize an answer. And I tell them, this is not just so that you can get through my BA exam. That's really of no importance. I'm telling you how to write for the senior partner in the firm, or for the general counsel of the company, or whatever the setting is that you're in. This is how to do it. And students need that, and they deserve that kind of experience, and they deserve to be told where their reasoning isn't working. But once they figured that out, we need to lift them up also for who they are as people, because that's going to have as much to do, if not more, with their success as lawyers than the checking the box on the reasoning part and the writing part. Unfortunately, our business model doesn't allow for it. That's really the core. We have a business model that feeds employers who are looking to reduce their risk by limiting their hires in some way that they think guarantees them more high outcomes, meaning I only want to hire students in the top X% of the class. And yes, do I know that there's someone in the bottom 30% who could perhaps be even better? I know that, but I have no way of checking it out front. So I'm sticking to the top, whatever, 20% of the class. Somehow that system has to be broken. And we either have to find, raise tuitions beyond what they already are, which is crazy in the case of private schools, or find some other way to finance this that will give us more faculty who will spend one-on-one time with students. Not every member of my faculty is going to teach 70 students and take 3 of them out to lunch every day. I do it for personal joy, but they have other things to do. Many of my faculty are younger. They have children at home. They have articles to write, different things. So, yeah, it's an intractable problem, and I don't have answers.
Well, let me ask you this: as dean of a school that hopefully personifies some of these more progressive and practical focused traits, do you think about ways to incentivize faculty to either interact with students or do their scholarship or otherwise carry out something that's atypical to perhaps the traditional theoretical models where people are just looking at writing, counting how many angels can dance on the head of a pin?
You just said it. Angels dancing on the head of the pin is the problem. Faculty are going to value what their colleagues value and what the guild that they have joined values. And scholarship is a preeminent part of that. We here at Carolina value teaching almost as much as we do scholarship, maybe as much. We're unusual, I think, in that regard for a school position the way that we are. I also value service to the school a great deal because things have to be done and faculty have to lead them, and faculty who are willing to lead particular initiatives have to be rewarded for that. When you're done with those 3 things, that there's just the head of the pen doesn't allow for very much more. Now, I make financial resources available to faculty who want to entertain students, spend time with students. If a faculty member said, I want to be able to take my torts students out to lunch in small groups, I would find a way to cover that. But, as dean and at this particular point in my trajectory as dean, I may have a little bit more free choice in that regard than my faculty do. And so I have to respect where they are.
So let's talk about your relationship with the state government, your state school. And one of the reasons, as you mentioned, they looked at your candidacy favorably was because they believed that you would be a good interface with the state government. So tell us about your experience in that role and your leadership lessons, if you like, over the past 8 years, focusing on that particular aspect.
Well, sort of as I answered your first question, I'll throw out a couple of premises and then try to answer the question more directly. It's important to know about me a couple of things. One is I am a lifelong North Carolinian. I live very close to the hospital where I was born, and my family has been in this state for a very, very, very long time. What that means is I grew up, it was simply in the water that I drank, knowing something about how the state of North Carolina operated. It was what we talked about at home, what people I encountered in the world talked about. And I also think it's fair to say I know something about the University of North Carolina and how it was created and how it has been sustained across its 230 some odd year history. those were advantages coming into my position that had I been a dean who was a faculty member at some other school brought in to be dean at Chapel Hill, I don't know how you could acquire them in adequate enough time. And so what that means is if I had been that sort of a dean, I would have been thrown back on the external lobbying and other resources that the university has, which are very good and do a fine job. The problem is, this is a campus of 15 schools and academic units. Every one of them is unique. Every one of them needs something. And it's helpful to know that you can call people yourself rather than depending on an institutional force to do it. So that's a bit of background. The second piece of background is that it's well known nationally. North Carolina went through a dramatic change in political power at the state level after the 2010 census, and the state went from being a place that was run primarily by the Democratic Party and office holders of the Democratic Party for about a century to a state that is largely run by entirely either by the Republican Party or in a split government scenario, which has been the case some in recent years. And we have a Democratic governor now, and the Republican Party controls both houses of the state legislature. So it's a complicated situation, and it's a situation of a good deal of political volatility. The university itself is very much a subject of interest to that volatility, if you will, because it is, I think it's very fair to say, the most precious institution in the state of North Carolina. Remember when I was a candidate to be dean, I was visiting with a friend who's the general counsel of a private institution, a very prestigious private institution not so far from here that will remain unnamed. And we were chatting, and he said to me, well, anyone who knows anything about North Carolina knows that of the 100 good things that have ever happened in this state, 95 have gone through Chapel Hill somehow. And it's entirely true. This university is an economic engine. It is a trainer of leaders. It is a very precious institution. At the same time, it is a place that is not always in sync with the dominant political ethos of significant sections of the state. And we're very familiar with this, and we're seeing it in other states around the country, as all of us in the academy are very, very well aware. So I walked into that kind of situation, and I think probably I was picked as dean in part to deal with that situation. So now to your question, how have I done it? By saying I've done it doesn't mean I've done it well, but I will say how I've done it. I would say lesson one is to personalize every relationship with an office holder to the greatest extent possible. And how do you do that? If you're dealing with a legislator, unless I am summoned, I never go to Raleigh to the legislative building when the legislature is in session to meet with a legislator about a law school issue, unless I'm summoned. What I will do is wait till the session is over, wait till Friday, get in my car, drive to the legislator's hometown, drive to their place of business, make an appointment, and sit down with them in their office and talk to them for as long as they're willing to talk to me. And what you learn is the legislator who maybe spoke in a rather more virulent manner when they were surrounded by other politicians in Raleigh suddenly becomes the soul of reason when you talk to them in their home place.
How did you figure that out?
I didn't figure it out. It seemed pretty obvious, pretty just common sense. If they're in Raleigh, they're very busy. They have a lot of people pulling at them. They have lobbyists going after them. They have committee meetings. They have finite time. And you're just not going to get their attention. You need the fact that the dean of a law school or any school at UNC Chapel Hill is prepared to get in a car and drive and take personal time away to meet with that legislator. You just cannot quantify the goodwill that it purchases.
And it does indeed seem like common sense. Do you know how many other people do it?
I have no idea. I really don't. If I'm asked by other deans, how do I help with the legislature? This is the advice I always give them. And I think some are doing it. I accept every speaking engagement that I am given, particularly if it is in a rural county or a part of North Carolina away from the Triangle or Charlotte. Because I think it's very important that people in smaller communities know that the university is prepared to come to them. The rap on Chapel Hill is we sit here sort of fat and happy and everybody has to come to us. And you have to do everything that you can to change that perception, knowing that you won't change it entirely. The people of North Carolina have a very funny relationship with their flagship university. And the politicians know this. And it means they're often, in my view, confused about what they want to do with Carolina. And they will say one thing and wind up doing something entirely different because at some level, they know this place is very, very important to the people of the state.
Does that give you, think, a comparative advantage compared to, well, the institution that shall not be named, or indeed more broadly, institutions across the country?
Well, the private institutions don't need it because they aren't getting any state support. So they have nothing. They have nothing to gain. I mean, presumably, maybe there are a few things that they might run up against state government for. But in our case, it directly has to do with the receipt of state funds to operate the institution. Our tuition right now is between $25,000 and $26,000 a year for in-state students. And the North Carolina rule is that once you have resided in North Carolina for a year, you're allowed to pay in-state tuition. So let's say that of our entering first-year class, let's say 40% are out-of-state students. And our out-of-state tuition is about $40,000 a year. They're only going to pay that $40,000 a year for 1 year because they're then going to immediately flip and become in-state residents and only have to pay the $25,000. But when you compare that to the tuition that we all know lots of law schools are charging, which is 3 times that amount, the balance has to come from somewhere, and the state of North Carolina plays a major role in that. So the state is a donor to the law school, a very significant donor, and its interests and needs have to be addressed. This requires, at times, explanation and a request for forbearance or grace. And that's my job. You know, faculty members have the job of writing and speaking what they see in the pursuit of truth. And what they see does not necessarily make every office holder happy. And it's not their job to go and beg to have their salary not cut as a result. It's my job to make sure their salary isn't cut.
Let's switch gears and talk about you as a person. One interesting thing that jumped out of your bio was your time in the University of Cologne, where you studied papyrology. Am I pronouncing it correctly? You know, at the Institute for Ancient Studies. What inspired that choice?
Well, I was a classics concentrator as an undergraduate and was pretty sure I wanted to get a PhD in classics. And so this was simply a fellowship with a German papyrologist named Reinhold Merkelbach, who had been the dissertation advisor of my Harvard Greek professor, one of my Harvard professors. And so it was a chance to go and work with Professor Merkelbach. It strikes me that if your listeners knew what papyrology even is, they probably haven't been spending their time very fruitfully. Let me say what it is. Papyrus is a reed that grows in the Nile basin, and it was harvested in the ancient world, split in half, placed in a frame, beaten with a maul until all of the plant fibers and liquid in the plant were rendered out and dried in the sun. And that was paper in the ancient world. There were two forms of writing material, papyrus and vellum, which is animal skin, dried animal skin. Papyrus was the cheap form of writing material. And it so happens that a good bit of papyrus, mainly from the Hellenistic period, so the period sort of between about the 4th century BCE and, let's say, the 1st century CE, somewhere in there, survives in Egypt in these jars that are uncovered in archaeological digs. And it survives because the climate is so arid that there's not moisture causing the papyrus to totally disintegrate. But inevitably, the papyrus is somewhat disintegrated. It's typically in bad shape. And so papyrology is the science/art of taking papyrus scrolls or leaves that have been discovered in archaeological digs in Egypt and placing sections of the scroll under a microscope and transcribing to what is typically Greek, sometimes Latin, sometimes Coptic, and speculating about missing letters that might be sitting in a hole in the paper. The holes are called lacunae, which means lakes in Latin. So your Latin and Greek have to be good enough to be able to guess. And that's what papyrus is. It's like a crossword puzzle. There's some clues and then there's some guesses. And so I did that for a couple of years.
And what does that translate into in terms of understanding the kind of person that you are, or how you might see leadership?
Oh, well, I think probably the most obvious thing is that it shows what I was saying earlier in our conversation, which is that I had a certain academic proclivity. I mean, looking at papyrus leaves in Greek is not exactly like standing up and giving a speech or winning a political office. It's a fairly nerdy kind of activity. But I think to elevate it a bit, I could foresee possibly that a person who came to a deanship of a law school purely from a private sector life would have some difficulty appreciating the solitariness, the deep challenges of the scholarly life that our faculty are endeavoring to live. It's not an easy life. It's not an easy thing that faculty are attempting to do. And to make an original contribution in a field of scholarship is a lonely business. And so that's probably its main contribution to what I do now is I have some appreciation for what it's like to care about something that nobody else cares about.
In May of 2013, you received an award from the North Carolinian Society. And the question which I had framed actually touches on this in all three areas: faith, family, and music. During your acceptance speech, you described yourself as not so much a dean as an artist and a teacher. Say a bit more about that.
It was just this past May 2023, actually. And well, I'm impressed that you would read the speech. What I was trying to communicate is that we change as people over time. And there was a point in my life in which I thought that achievement in the form of holding certain positions and offices, not necessarily a deanship, but one could name all sorts of other things, a bar presidency, perhaps. Those sorts of externally facing goals were important to me, as I think they often are to people in a certain sort of first half of life place. But what I've learned as our children have left home and as I've aged and I hope matured and gotten a little wiser in this job is I've learned more about myself. And the parts of the job that I love and that I think I'm actually best at are the parts that are involve the teaching, they involve creativity and working with students in trying to help faculty and staff achieve their own potential without getting in the way. And the artist part, of course, is, I am a fairly serious musician. I do write a bit for myself. And I find that part of my personality far more important than I did when I became dean, and certainly earlier than that. I was busy raising children and building a law practice and so forth. Now it's just extremely important that I have time for the oboe, for the piano, for chamber music with friends. I have to have those things in my life. And if there are things that don't get done at the school because I have to go play some chamber music, they just won't get done. And what I've learned is if I walk away and go to do my thing, somebody else will take care of it, probably better than I could have.
And I want to make sure that you know that we will put a link to not one, but both of the videos, because the first part of it is where you give a speech and you have a segment where you play excerpts of music. And then I'm thinking at the end of it, do we actually get to hear the man himself play? And so the answer to that is yes, but it was in the second part of that video. So we'll put both parts up there so they can both hear the speech, which I thought was an excellent speech, but also the performance, which was no less outstanding. During that celebration of your achievements, you also had one of your children, your daughter, talk about you. And she said, I want you to know how glad I am, how glad I think we all are that you were born and that you are alive to be the person that God created you to be, and that you should keep your big self and know that I love you very much. What was going through your head when you heard that from your daughter?
Well, it's overwhelming when our adult children reflect on us. And that daughter, whose name is Eliza, is a second-year student at the Virginia Theological Seminary, where she's on the road to ordination as an Episcopal priest. And so I would say faith was an important part of our family, an important part of her growing up. And at one level, to hear her ability to articulate that sort of concept is a reflection of where she is in her life. And so I think the first reaction is one of gratitude for having a child who is even able to put that sort of set of thoughts together. The second then is one of just wonder that a child could be so reflective about oneself, because I think as parents, we never really perceive how our children perceive us. It's impossible. And so you get into this funny situation where you're being given a recognition for something and your child speaks, and it can be quite overwhelming. Now, I felt very emotional about it at the moment. I did not get emotional because I had to play the Schumann Adagio and Allegro, which is a challenging work. So I couldn't afford to lose it too much. But yeah, it was quite wonderful.
So Joe Robinson and Kensuke Wakao, would you consider them to be your mentors?
Certainly, I would consider them to be my artistic mentors, along with a pianist, Tom Mann, my teacher of 38 years, who just passed away recently.
Did they teach? Go ahead.
No.
Did they teach you anything about leadership?
Well, I would say Keisuke in particular. We have a wonderful relationship, and for a person for whom English is not a first language, and I think I even mentioned this in the talk, he has an extraordinary ability to express himself in metaphor about oboe playing, and I would say the way that Keisuke teaches me to play the oboe is almost exactly the same way that I try to teach students business associations, particularly those who struggle or perhaps don't do as well on the exam as they would like. And what I mean by that is this. One of the things I learned from Keisuke is that the art of playing the oboe is all in the air. It's all about how the air is delivered to the reed by the oboist. And if the air is healthy and the oboist is calm and has an almost sort of Zen-like meditative approach to playing, many technical problems that occur with the fingers simply fade away. If you let the oboe be run by this digity stuff, the breath will be interrupted and it's a disaster. It's far better to play with very healthy air and play a few wrong notes. In fact, one of the things Keisuke has taught me is the audience loves a wrong note, because a wrong note shows that you're human. The audience doesn't want perfection. The audience wants beauty, and beauty is flawed. Beauty is always flawed. So if you make a mistake, as long as the air was good, don't worry about it. That's very much a way that, now he plays in the Boston Symphony Orchestra. He doesn't make many mistakes. You can't, but you can make some, and things will actually be better if you make some. I try to give my students permission to approach their lives as human beings and as lawyers in that kind of place of centeredness, of a kind of meditative quiet in which externalities such as grades, while they may be painful or exuberant experiences in the moment, don't occupy too much territory, because they have another 50 years of life, at least, if not 60, to live after they get through law school, most of them. That's what matters, not this immediate thing here. But because they've all lived their lives in short little bursts of achievement leading to a next stage of achievement, this is very new to them.
That's all very profound at many levels. Final question for you. What's on the horizon for Martin Brinkley?
Thank you so much, Daryl, for the question. I don't know. I'm trying to just enjoy each day. That may sound like cliche, but I really, all I'm thinking about right now, today, when we get done with this program, is how do I write up a model answer for my BA students on the partnership question that I gave them this morning in a way that will be most helpful to them. I love being in the classroom. I like writing. I like playing the oboe. I expect there will be a time when the administrative parts of deaning, and maybe some even of the inspired or strategic parts, that I won't be the person to fill that anymore here, and it will need someone else. And I'm entirely prepared for whenever that ought to happen. I have no aspirations for provostships or chancellorships or presidencies or any of those sorts of things. Those all look to me like far worse versions of the job I already have. I'd much rather go and teach another section of business associations, to be honest. So we'll see.
Well, during your award ceremony, somebody that knows you a lot better than me described you as the maestro of elegance. And so I can see how through your responses and all that comes true in so many different ways. Thank you for your service. Thank you for all that you do to enrich not just the academic community, the musical community, the faith community, and the other many other communities which we might have only touched on tangentially today. It's been a real pleasure speaking with you, and all the very best for the rest of your term and all the other things that you have planned.
It's an honor.
Thank you.